Hello folks, now we are up to precept number 6. This is how you would indicate number 6 in Japan. There, you learned something from this video. The standard version of this precept that I always learned, that comes in Nishijima Roshi's discussion of it, is don't discuss failures of Buddhist priests and lay people. And here's how he defines it. As Buddhists, we are trying our best to live and practice the Buddhist life. In doing so, we often make mistakes. This is natural. Our mistakes come directly from our efforts. This may sound strange, but it is a fact in our life. So when we see the mistakes of others, we should not be critical, for their mistakes are only the product of their efforts in this life. And the Brahmajala Sutra, which also kind of takes the same version of the precept, goes like this. Here's how they define it. A disciple of the Buddha must not himself broadcast the misdeeds or infractions of bodhisattva clerics or bodhisattva laypersons, or of ordinary monks and nuns, nor encourage others to do so. He must not create the causes, conditions, methods, or karma of discussing the offenses of the assembly. As a Buddha's disciple, whenever he hears evil persons, externalists, or followers of the two vehicles speak of practices contrary to the Dharma or contrary to the precepts within the Buddhist community, he should instruct them with a compassionate mind and lead them to develop wholesome faith in the Mahayana. If instead he discusses the faults and misdeeds that occur within the assembly, he commits a major offense. Now, the problem for me with the idea that this precept is about not discussing the faults of Buddhist priests and lay people, limiting it to that, it becomes kind of a shield. And I have seen incidents where, to me, it looks like certain Buddhist priests are expecting to be able to get away with stuff without being criticized because there's a precept against people calling them out on bad things they do. Don't know for sure that this is happening, but it does seem to me that there's an expectation that no one can criticize, and of course that makes people be able to get away with stuff, without with feeling like they have impunity. But, as you'll notice, even in Nishijima Roshi's version of this, he's already starting to expand it. He gives the precept as, don't discuss the failures of Buddhist priests and lay people, but then when he gives his explanation of the precept, it sort of applies to everyone. Don't discuss the faults of others in general. So he's already kind of seeing it that way. And then when we get to Dogen's version of the precept, his Kyoju Kaimon, which I just talked to Muho about this, and he says Kyoju Kaimon may or may not have been written by Dogen, but it's a commentary on the precepts which is often attributed to Dogen, but it may have been written by one of his later disciples, probably based on things he heard from Dogen, but maybe not necessarily written by Dogen himself. But anyway, here's what either Dogen or Eijo has to say about it. Not discussing faults of others. In the Buddha Dharma, there is one path, one Dharma, one realization, one practice. Don't permit fault-finding. Don't permit haphazard talk. Now, if we go into what some American and European Buddhist centers or Zen centers are saying about this, you'll see that most of them are making the precept about not finding faults at all, rather than not finding faults specifically with Buddhist priests and lay people. For example, Shasta Abbey's version is the 6th grave precept on speaking against others. Griffith Folk gives it as the 6th precept not to point out transgressions of others. Boundless Way Zen Center has a longer one. Unconditionally accepting what each moment has to offer, I vow to take up the way of not discussing the faults of others. There is no slander is Wonderling. Let's see. Go down a few. Robert Aitken, no speaking the faults of others. Abstinence from speaking ill of others is Akiyama Roshi. Let's see. Do not discuss others' faults is what Maizumi Roshi says. Philip Kapleau is not speaking of the shortcomings of others, but be understanding and sympathetic. Let's look for a long one. Okay, Appleton Zen Center, always reliable for a long version. Honor silence. I remember the perniciousness of silence. I see the perfection of others and refrain from gossip and frivolous conversation. I remain thoughtful and mindful of the effects of my speech. And Diane Ishin Risotto, also reliable for a long version. of a precept, I take up the way of speaking of others with openness and possibility. When I talk about others, who is speaking? Fear and shame inside push critical words outside. I vow to pause so the distress in the mind and body can speak. That's an interesting one. But my favorite version of all of these is the version that I first heard when Tim McCarthy gave the precepts years ago when I was studying with him. And it's Cobancino's version. Not speaking of past mistakes, that's one version he gave, and not dwelling on past mistakes, that's another version he gave. So let's see what he has to say about it in his book, Embracing Mind, Zen Talks of Kobancino Otogawa. First, he gives the Bodhidharma One Mind precept version, which you'll remember from a few videos ago what that is. Self-nature is mysteriously profound. In the midst of unmistakable truth, not to speak of past mistakes is called the precept of no speaking of past mistakes. And I remember Tim remarking on this, saying that all the others are kind of mystical sounding, but this one is just not speaking of past mistakes is not speaking of past mistakes. There's no sort of attempt to kind of make it into something, other than what it is. And Cobancino's comments on this are just one paragraph, so I'll read the whole thing. The sixth and seventh precepts relate with the fourth precept, no illusory words. So there is no speaking of people's mistakes and misunderstanding, no praising yourself while you are feeling blame of others, and no praising others while you are blaming yourself. The spirit of this is thinking before speaking or acting, and instead offering good actions, thoughts, and speech. These precepts are about words, the many sides of language. It is important to speak with fine timing and with truth from within. The true loving quality which appears with words is necessary if we wish to relate with other people. And that's all he says about it. I like the idea of no speaking of past mistakes or no dwelling on past mistakes because it goes a little further than just, eliminating the idea of not speaking of past mistakes of Buddhist monks and lay people, and then the other versions say don't speak of past mistakes of others. The Cobancino version, I don't know if he intended it this way. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. But it takes it one step further, and it says no dwelling on past mistakes, period. So you're not dwelling on the past mistakes or speaking of the past mistakes of others or Buddhist priests and lay people, but you're also not dwelling on the past mistakes that you have made. Now, I can tell you from vast experience doing Zazen practice that one of the most pernicious, to use a word that was brought up in one of these precept translations, things that happens during Zazen is your own past mistakes coming up. I mean, you might dwell on the past mistakes of others too, but for me, it's dwelling on my own past mistakes. It always comes up, and I've even seen, I think Koban mentions it, I think Dainin Katagiri mentions it, it's mentioned by contemporary Zen teachers too, that when you are doing Zazen, you are often dwelling on your own past mistakes and going, oh hell, I did this. But as Dogen says, even thinking, oh hell, I did the wrong thing back then, is energy arising from the desire not to do bad things in the future. That's my paraphrase of something from Shoaku Makusa, which I translated, or not translated, paraphrased as don't be a jerk in my book, Don't Be a Jerk. It means not doing wrongs. And I've been working actually a lot on that chapter for this upcoming book I'm working on. So even when you are dwelling on your past mistakes, the reason you are dwelling on the past mistakes is because you don't want to make them again. But the mind often gets confused and you're just beating yourself up over something you did 5 or 10 years ago or whatever it is. Just don't do that thing again. Realize that that was not the right thing to do. Don't do it again. After that has been accomplished, there isn't really any need to keep harping on it to yourself or to anyone else. So I think this is a great precept and super practical and really straightforward. This one and the one about not lying are really super straightforward. And actually, the precepts from here on in, if I'm remembering them right, are often pretty straightforward. The other thing that might be interesting to folks out there is that the first 5 precepts, the ones I gave you last week, are pretty much the same throughout all forms of Buddhism. The Mahayana Buddhism, the so-called Hinayana lesser vehicle, or Theravada is the more proper name these days to call them, way of the elders. Buddhism has those first 5 precepts in common with the Mahayana. The next 5 precepts are quite different. In the older version, the Theravada version, it's such things as not eating after... God, I can't remember. You know what? I'll look them up and I'll give them to you in the next video. But they're quite different. I think one of them is no watching singing or dancing and things. The first time I became aware of the differences is I got an email after Hardcore Zen had been published, and I don't think any other books had been published yet. And it was from a guy in, I think, Singapore or Indonesia, who told me he practices the first 5 precepts every day, and he practices the next 5, together with the first 5 on weekends. And I was like, really? You don't speak of people's past mistakes, and you don't find fault with others, or what's the other one? You're not covetous. These are the ones that are in the last 5 in the Mahayana version. And I was like, you don't do those on weekends? That doesn't make sense. But he was talking more about not going out and singing and dancing on weekends, and I think there might be an eating precept in there. I'll tell you next time what they are. I don't remember them. But they're quite different. So the next 5 that we're going to give, or including this one, the next 4, they're going to be different from the older Theravada precepts, but the first 5 are pretty much the same. So there you go. That's it. Don't dwell on past mistakes. So that's the point of this. But if you want to do something that is not a past mistake, you can donate to me via PayPal and Patreon. The links are below on the screen, or if you're watching on YouTube, they're in the description of the video as links directly to the Patreon and PayPal links. Thank you very much. Some new people have joined Patreon recently, and that's always great to see for me. If you are having financial trouble, do not donate to me. Please don't. But those of you who are not having financial trouble and are donating to me, that is the way I make my living. Thank you very much. Have a good time all the time. See you later. Bye.